Hello, my name is John Krzeski, and I want to thank this conference's nominating committee for the honor of being able to present to you today on the status of the ISO-SAE 21434 standard and its potential alignment with functional safety or ISO 26262. On our agenda, first, I'd like to talk to you about my company, Eaton, and its cybersecurity. Then we'll talk about the status of cybersecurity guidelines and standards in automotive. Then, in particular, the 21434 standard in regards to its document structure, the associated timeline for release, and collaboration between functional safety and cybersecurity in light of 21434 in regards to estimating the level of impact due to a cybersecurity attack affecting safety. Then we'll talk about the interrelations between cybersecurity and functional safety during the product development V cycle and potential points that they can collaborate during product development and even post development. First, I'd like to talk to you about my company. Well, we're dedicated to improving people's lives and the environment through power management technologies that are reliable, efficient, and safe. Basically, we're solving the toughest power management challenges in various industries from aerospace, marine, vehicles, utilities, water and wastewater treatment, and in other areas. We also are strong at Eaton in regards to cybersecurity in the supply chain, realizing the criticality of it. And we recognize that it is critical that throughout the entire product life cycle, from inception to decommissioning, that risk management is vital to make sure our customers are safe and our products work as intended. We also have a vulnerability response and associated cybersecurity communications. And the vulnerability response policy is available to the public to ensure that Eaton effectively manages cybersecurity vulnerabilities from early detection to response. We are particularly excited about our partnership with Underwriters Laboratories, as our labs and the secure development lifecycle processes and products are the first to be certified under UL's 2900 cybersecurity standards. Additionally, we also work with Underwriters Labs to drive the IEC 62443 standards for conformance assessments. Now, regarding the status of cybersecurity guidelines and standards, today, well, there's currently no released automotive cybersecurity standards. There are best practices from SAE's J3061, those from NIST and the Auto ISAC. However, OEMs and Tier 1s, they've developed their own unique cybersecurity requirements. In the future, there will be a jointly published standard both by SAE and ISO, expected in 2021, called again ISO SAE 21434, which encompasses and it will supersede the SAE J3061 best practice. Now, it's similar to functional safety in that it does require defined work products at both the organizational level and project level. And it does require formal audits and assessments, much like functional safety. And interestingly enough, OEMs are already requesting adherence to ensure that they are compliant upon its release. Now, regarding the table of contents of 21434, the overall document structure, there's the typical scope, normative references, terms and definitions, and general considerations in Clause 4. Then in Clause 5, we talk about overall cybersecurity management. Clause 6 deals with cybersecurity management within projects or project-specific cybersecurity management. Then Clause 7 deals with the activities that are continuously done throughout the entire product lifecycle. The risk assessment methods are discussed in Clause 8 in regards to how do you assess risk in the concept phase, product development phases, cybersecurity validation, and post-development phases, which are discussed in clauses 9 through 14, respectively. Finally, Clause 15 deals with distributed cybersecurity activities, or those cases where you are working with suppliers or perhaps sub-suppliers to ensure that your product is secure. In regards to the delegations that are working on 21434, well, there are those from the ISO organization and the associated SAE experts. On the ISO side, the nations are listed, and on the SAE side, the individuals from SAE are listed on the right side, with myself being one of the experts nominated to represent the United States for the Society of Automotive Engineers. In regards to timeline of 21434, well, it initiated in October of 2016. And the latest status is the results from the draft international standard or DIS ballot was released in April of 2020. And we are anticipating addressing the comments received from the DIS and publishing the FDIS approximately in February of next year. Then we anticipate receiving the results from the FDIS ballot, and if it passes, publication at a mid-2021 release is expected. And again, these timelines are estimated in the future based on the current status. Now, in regards to collaboration between functional safety and cybersecurity, well, they are interrelated in regards to safety. But functional safety, it looks at safety from the perspective that you have systematic or random hardware failures. However, cybersecurity looks at safety from the perspective that an attacker is intentionally trying to cause harm. Now, of course, cybersecurity looks at other aspects due to financial, operational, and privacy impacts, but for the purposes of this presentation, we'll talk about safety. So when you do estimate the potential impact to safety for a particular cybersecurity threat, it is very important that functional safety is consulted. They are the experts on safety. So again, keep in mind that functional safety, they're evaluating the automotive safety integrity level, or ASIL, for hazards that are caused by failures. Cybersecurity, well, they're looking at it in regards to someone intentionally causing harm. So because of the differences that cybersecurity looks at it from an intentional perspective, the ASILs that are assigned by cybersecurity will not apply directly, or in most cases, to cybersecurity, because again, they're looking at it from the perspective of systematic or random hardware failures. However, the advantages, the components that make up the ASIL will be helpful in quantifying the level of safety impact when an attack occurs. So we'll talk about that in more detail. So in regards to estimating the level of impact due to an attack affecting safety, well, let's first look at how functional safety looks at safety, how it derives the ASILs. ASILs are a function of severity, exposure, and controllability, where severity, well, that's the estimated level of harm to individuals as a result of a hazardous event. Exposure, that is the probability that the individuals would be in a state where the hazardous event could occur. And controllability looks at the ability of the individuals to take action and thus avoid harm of the particular event. So, direct application of the functional safety ASIL ratings to cybersecurity, it's unlikely. However, again, you can use one or more of the factors that make up the ASIL to derive the impact to cybersecurity. The exposure parameter of functional safety, however, it's not related to likelihood of the cybersecurity attack. The likelihood of an attack must be derived independently of the exposure of functional safety, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. So again, in regards to estimating impact, if there's an ASIL assigned to the function that does relate to a cybersecurity attack, well, then you can leverage that information. Specifically, the severity of the potential harm classification, it does apply. You can use it. Controllability, well, you may be able to consider controllability, and we'll give an example in a few moments. And again, reminder that the controllability as being the persons at risk, are they able to gain sufficient control to mitigate the impact? So you may need to estimate the controllability if the event from a cybersecurity perspective isn't the same as a functional safety hazard event. The exposure, well, it might be applicable, but again, you have to look at it in light of a cybersecurity attack. If there's no ASIL assigned to the function that is related to an attack from a cybersecurity perspective, well, work with your functional safety team to estimate the safety impact. Again, they're the experts. So consider the functional safety for severity, and again, optionally, the estimates of controllability and exposure. So let's talk about some details. Since functional safety estimates controllability and exposure due to systematic or random hardware failures, well, the exposure and controllability values, they might be different for cybersecurity. Let me give an example. Suppose an attacker causes unintended acceleration of the vehicle and they simultaneously disable brakes. Well, from a functional safety perspective, in the case of the unintended acceleration, it's likely that the driver would be able to use the brakes to reduce the hazard of the event. However, simultaneous brake failure is exactly what the attacker is trying to do, but from a functional safety perspective, they consider simultaneous brake failure extremely unlikely. So again, from an attack perspective, they've also disabled the brakes. So in this case, controllability would be low from a cybersecurity perspective because that is exactly is the purpose of the attack. In the case where the attacker wishes to cause the vehicle to go through an evasive maneuver where they control the steering and erratically move the steering wheel, well, from a functional space safety perspective, exposure in evasive maneuvers would be considered relatively low because in the lifetime of a vehicle, the driver typically doesn't need to make evasive maneuvers, so they're relatively low at perhaps an E2 level. However, from a cybersecurity perspective, that's exactly what the attacker is trying to do. They're trying to cause the evasive maneuver, so in this particular case, the exposure is actually high. So let's talk about this from a practical perspective. I'm going to show a table that shows examples of how you could map the components of severity, exposure, and controllability to calculate the impact for cybersecurity. And again, it is vital that you collaborate with your functional safety team to make sure that you're accurately impacting the safety impact rating. So let's look at this in regards to cybersecurity and functional safety. From a functional safety impact, you have severity levels all the way from S0 to S3, S0 being the minimal, S3 being severe. Well, you could simply have a one-to-one mapping of an S3 severity event in functional safety mapping to a severe category in cybersecurity. Likewise, an S2 severity event mapping to a major event in cybersecurity, S1 in functional safety mapping to moderate, and finally S0 mapping to negligible. However, there may be cases where you do consider the other parameters, such as exposure and controllability. For example, let's consider this second case or second row in this table. Perhaps you have an S2 event, which normally would map to major, but perhaps in this case, the controllability is low or at a C3 level, or your exposure is high. Well, you may wish to map this S2 event to a severe event because controllability is low and exposure is high. Again, if exposure is applicable. If you look at it from a different perspective, there may be cases where a severe functional safety impact, you may want to reduce it to that of a major cybersecurity impact, not a severe. If you do have controllability, suppose you have high controllability, or in functional safety 26262 vernacular, a C0 value. Likewise, perhaps what would normally be considered an S1 functional safety event, severity 1 or moderate, again, if the controllability is high, you may map it to a negligible. But again, you want to work with your functional safety personnel to make sure that your assessment of the functional safety values are correct for the particular cybersecurity situation. In regards to collaboration between functional safety and cybersecurity, well, the mitigations that you require for cybersecurity and functional safety, they are complementary, but they will often impact the other discipline. For example, functional safety might require communications between two components. However, cybersecurity also considers that you need to verify those messages are authentic to stop unauthorized modification of safety related messages. So, because cybersecurity requires authentication, it would typically require what's called a hardware trust anchor and the associated hardware and software. So, for example, you may require a trusted platform module or TPM, a hardware security module such as an HSM. In other words, the generic term is a hardware trust anchor. Well, because of that, you need to consider that you might have failures in that hardware trust anchor. And if you do have failures in the hardware trust anchor, it will impact functional safety because you need to verify the authenticity of those messages. And because you're not able to perform that operation, you may not be able to relay on the message, and you are not assured of the authenticity of the message. So basically, you're unable to deliver the message. So it does impact functional safety. So because of that, if you also do not have a hardware trust anchor, in this case, an attacker could manipulate the messages. So you need the hardware trust anchor. But again, if there's a failure or a problem in it, it affects the ability to send that message. So for example, an attacker could modify the message that contains steering wheel angle to direct the car into oncoming traffic. So if you don't verify the authenticity, it's possible the attacker could modify the direction that the vehicle is headed and into oncoming traffic. So it is important that functional safety and cybersecurity, they need to collaborate frequently to make sure the two disciplines are aligned. For example, let's look at the gate reviews that are typically conducted for functional safety. In the concept phase, you performed a HERA or hazard analysis and risk assessment. During that, you determine your severity, exposure, and controllability values, thus resulting in an ASO value. You determine your safety goals, what is a safe state, and your fault tolerant time intervals, and ultimately determine your functional safety concept. Now that you're in the requirements and architecture phase, well, you want to allocate those functional requirements for functional safety to the architectural elements and look at your interfaces and analyze them and identify the associated requirements. Later in the design phase, you also want to define the technical safety requirements and allocate those requirements appropriately to the hardware and software elements, perform a fault tree analysis, and design for failure mode and effects analysis, and a failure modes and effects and diagnostic analysis. In your implementation stage, you will want to refine and recheck that your analysis is still correct and any assumptions that may have been made. Continuing on in the V cycle for functional safety, well, after you have implemented, you need to do functional safety verification and validation tests at the unit, integration, and vehicle level. After those tests are complete, you need to look at your safety case and ultimately make an assessment as to whether or not you are ready for production. So let's look at cybersecurity and the associated gates during the V cycle. At the beginning or in your concept phase, you perform a threat analysis and risk assessment or TERA, and as a function of that, you determine your risk level relative to a particular threat. And as a result of that threat, you determine the damage scenario. What could happen if that attack occurs? What is the associated impact to the end user or the road user? And what is the associated feasibility of that attack occurring? As a result of that, for those risks that are above a threshold and they are intolerable, well, then you derive your cybersecurity goals. From your goals, you come up with your cybersecurity concept and determine your initial requirements and allocate them to the preliminary architecture. Later, you will refine and verify those cybersecurity requirements in regards to architecture and design, and you then select controls considering the interfaces between items. You then allocate those requirements, similarly like you do with functional safety, to the architectural elements. And as always, you identify and manage vulnerabilities throughout the entire life cycle of the product. So unlike functional safety, in cybersecurity, you should be doing continuous risk assessments as you become aware of new vulnerabilities and how they might impact your product. Continuing on, as far as cybersecurity gate reviews, you then verify your requirements were met, and you do validation at the vehicle level and determine is your residual risk acceptable. Determine your cybersecurity case and make your final cybersecurity assessment. And it is recommended that you periodically revisit the cybersecurity of various elements throughout the V cycle. So you should basically do this periodically. And unlike functional safety, we do need to consider aspects of decommissioning. For example, you may have an infotainment unit with private data. Well, that private data needs to be properly deleted when an item is decommissioned. So that's another area where cybersecurity is unique compared to functional safety. And again, you do that continuous risk assessment throughout the entire life cycle of the product. So how can the two disciplines interact? How could they collaborate between functional safety and cybersecurity? Well, again, from a safety perspective, your TERA, you look at safety impacts. So at this point, it's recommended that you do simultaneous reviews of your recommended architecture, your cybersecurity and functional safety concepts and corresponding goals. You look at those initial requirements and determine, are there any conflicts? And perhaps there's complementary goals and requirements, but if there are conflicts, it's best to determine them as early as possible. You then review the updated architecture and requirements, including the interface requirements, and again, determine, are there any conflicting requirements? And earlier I gave an example of how there could be conflicting requirements in cybersecurity. For example, if you require a hardware trust anchor, that has an impact on on functional safety. And likewise, there may be functional safety items which do impact cybersecurity. So then you would then review those requirements that are allocated to the hardware and software to see if there are any conflicts. And at this point, it's recommended that you review, are there any points where you can collaborate during testing, both for functional safety and cybersecurity. And you want to review, are there any required changes in the design that impact the other disciplines? So as you discover things, does it affect cybersecurity? Does it affect functional safety? Continuing on, well, as part of your integration test and verification stage, it's recommended you do a joint review to see if there are any design changes as a result of testing. Perhaps you've had some failures, so maybe you need to revisit the design. And if there's a failure in cybersecurity, well, maybe a design change is needed, and that design change, again, could affect functional safety. Finally, you want to do a joint review of the residual risk and confirm that you have an adequate cybersecurity and functional safety case. And if there are issues in the field that require changes to the design, as we talked about before, because throughout the entire product lifecycle, there may be field issues. And as those field issues occur, particularly for cybersecurity, where a new vulnerability is discovered, well, a design change may be needed for cybersecurity to mitigate that new vulnerability that has been found. Well, does that affect functional safety? You want to work with your functional safety team because maybe the mitigation you're applying does impact functional safety. This concludes the presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.